This morning, for the time that I have remaining, I'd like to cover some content in our road trip series. As many of you know, a couple weeks ago, we started to narrate this long story in the Old Testament book, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, about how Israel is released from slavery in Egypt, and they go towards the promised land that God had promised their forefather Abraham several centuries before. And we're equating it to a road trip that you and I might take during the summer months, recognizing that there's different phases to a road trip, right? You've been there, and I think that what we're going to talk about today, this time of the story of the Old Testament community, is that part in the road trip where everyone's getting a little road weary. There's some irritability going on in the back seat, perhaps. You've had your second gas stop, and you made the poor decision to choose circus peanuts as your road snack. I want to recognize once again, those are stale, like the last batch was completely stale, and so on and so forth. There's a critical time in the middle of their journey, as we'll see in Numbers chapter 9, where the people of God had to make some transformation and some different decisions if they were going to endure the journey and also to be the people that God wanted them to be. And what we're going to see is how God acted in His grace to help form them to have a different sensibility, a different mentality, how He transformed them deeply that they would be suitable not just for the road ahead, but also for the generations ahead as God continued to move in and through this one unique group of people for the sake of the world. Through this sermon series, we're talking about transformation because just like this journey that the early Old Testament community went on themselves, we go on a journey with God, and there's some ups and there's some downs. I think we're going to find affinity with this group of people as we walk with them and as we narrate their story together. And then also there's some leadership moments in each of these stories for us, particularly as leaders in the life of the church or in our businesses or in our homes or in the different places where we find ourselves so that we could take from the scripture text as well. But before I get there, I want to start with this illustration from Jeopardy this past week. How many folks are like legit Jeopardy fanatics? Like if there was a bumper sticker, you would have it on your car. You say prayers for Alex Trebek as he's overcoming cancer. Okay, like you're that type of Jeopardy fan. Well, if you're that type of depth in your love and passion for Jeopardy, you know that this individual, James Holzhauer, nearly set a record for consecutive games and money won as a cash prize on the show of Jeopardy. He had a 32-game winning streak, and over the course of those 32 games, he put together $2.4 million in earnings. And his folks thought forever and ever he's just wasting his time in front of the TV. Who's laughing now, Mom and Dad? Seriously. This guy seemed unstoppable. But he ran into perhaps the greatest challenge, the greatest opponent that he could ever conceive of, a gal named Emma Bocher, who had this unique shape as a Jeopardy fan and as a Jeopardy contestant. When she was 18 years old, she applied to be on Jeopardy the first time. So like in her high school yearbook with all the superlatives, she was the most likely to be a Jeopardy contestant. Mom and Dad were proud about that, right? The story goes that she would sit in front of the show every single day, and she'd take a ballpoint pen, the clicker pen, and she would act like it was her buzzer in her hand so she could time herself with the questions. She would write down the different themes that she was not so great in so she can try to gain more knowledge in those certain areas. When she went to her master's program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, she had to write a master's thesis in information technology, and she wrote a master's thesis on the game Jeopardy, where she studied 22,000 questions over several years of shows to try to ascertain whether a computer program could predict how difficult a question could be because of how a question was asked to contestants. She is now a librarian at the University of Chicago, which is no slight. That's actually an amazing job. And so as she prepared for Jeopardy, she knew that she had won a spot on Jeopardy. She had no idea when she was going to be on Jeopardy. And in fact, we learned some information along the way here that they actually film 4 episodes of Jeopardy every day when they're filming Jeopardy. So she had no idea of James's streak until she got put on a show with him, and it dawned upon her the opportunity that she had. She had been training for all those years, in silence, in front of the TV, in the university halls at Chapel Hill, North Carolina, waiting for her moment, and this was her moment, and she could either be afraid or could she be confident in all of her experience beforehand. And she had a perfect game when she faced off against James. In fact, every question she was allowed to answer, she answered it correctly. And she concluded the game as its winner. And she took home $46,000 in earnings from this one episode. I think her experience and her challenge that she faced going against James is a model, a bit of an illustration of the Christian life, but it's also a picture, I think, of what we're going to see in the book of Numbers chapter 9, and the potential that each of us, you and I, have as modern-day Christians today. But before we get to Numbers chapter 9, let's keep in mind the mentality of this group of people that God is dealing with in the wilderness. There seems to be a couple of colliding narratives that they're facing as they journey through the wilderness with God. On the one hand, this is a desperate people. They're people of desperation. They've been crying out to God, as you heard early in the story, in that founding story in Exodus chapter 3, because of the crushing weight in their experience in an empire. They're slaves. And then even in Moses' first intervention attempt, Moses puts on them a heavier burden, more workload for them to try to endure as slaves in Egypt. But we also know that not only has this community been crushed again and again, generation after generation, because of being in an empire, on the other end of their paradox, the conflicting narrative, is that the people who are easily offended. We noticed it last week as they were journeying through the wilderness, and as they were trying to get up out of Egypt, they were at the Red Sea in front of them, and Pharaoh's army was behind them. And at that critical moment, they began to raise an offense against God and against Moses. That situation was one of the 7 times where at critical moments in their story, when they're going through challenges, instead of digging in, of seeing what they're made of, and going further and just trusting God, they decide to lobby an offense against Moses and against God. And so they have a couple things working against one another. Number one, they're a desperate people. They're paralyzed by fear. The other thing on the other end of their paradox is that they're easily offended and they can't move forward in those times of challenges. And it makes me think that perhaps one or both of these things could be operating in your life and my life. Because at some points in our life, we are people of desperation as well. We're trying to endure significant challenges. There's situations happening in our life. It seems like we're being attacked on every side. It seems like there's hardships everywhere we turn, and there seems like there is no answer. The scratch paper logic, pros and cons, seems to give us no peace at night. The hours of prayer seem to yield no direction forward, and we wonder what could happen next. And instead of having a positive and optimistic outlook for the future, we're paralyzed by fear as well. And this might be difficult to imagine, but perhaps at times in life, we're easily offended as well. Now, I know that I'm not talking about Advent Presbyterian Church here, but imagine with me, in some fictitious land, in other churches out there, that when things don't go our way, when the pattern and process of the thing that we desire is not acknowledged, when our opinion is not considered more deeply, instead of digging in and saying, well, I didn't win today, I didn't get my way today, but maybe I'll get my way tomorrow, we raise our voice in great offense. And we struggle to move forward because we are people of an offended heart instead of a believing heart. Well, I wonder if we walk alongside this community in the Old Testament this morning, and that maybe we can face both our fears and our moments of desperation and the temptation to be easily offended as we walk with them and undergo the same transformation that this early community received as well. Numbers chapter 9 is an interesting passage that we're going to cover this morning, because right before it, there seems to be instructions for the holiday called the Passover. And then in chapter 10, right after this passage, there's some instructions about how to build some trumpets and what to do with these trumpets. And then the writer of Numbers is almost seemed to do like a facepalm moment here. Oh, I forgot to tell them about the cloud. So in verses 15 through the remainder of this passage, we hear this unusual story about a cloud that follows the Old Testament community. What they were camping in the wilderness as they were journeying with God. And there was also a house of worship where they offered sacrifices to God. And the writer says in verses 15 and 16 that this cloud was a pillar of cloud by the day that would shield the community from the harsh sun of the desert. But then it would turn into a great pillar of fire that would give them the adequate heat at the nighttime when the sun goes away and the temperatures plummet in these desert regions. It was like a Costco-sized space heater for the community of Israel. This interesting phenomenon follows them around. And so they camp around the tent of meeting, and this cloud is there, and everyone leaves their tent every single morning, and they watch to see what the cloud is going to do. You look at verses 17 through 18, and we hear some more description about the cloud. Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites moved and set out with it. Wherever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped there. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in the camp. So everything depended upon what the cloud did on that day. This cloud had many purposes. Number one, it was for their provision. Once again, it provided the adequate shade and the adequate heat for their journey. But it also was a sign that they were God's people. Imagine being a neighboring community and thousands of people are walking through your territory with tents, and as you get the army together and march out towards them, you see the cloud and you go, I don't think we want zero problems with this group of people. It was a sign that God was with them. But as we see in the next few verses, the cloud was also a test for the community of Israel. We see in verses 19 and following, when the cloud remained over the tabernacle a long time, the Israelites obeyed the Lord's order and did not set out. Sometimes the cloud was over the tabernacle only a few days. At the Lord's command, they would encamp, and then at his command, they would set out. Sometimes the cloud stayed for only evening till morning, and when it lifted in the morning, they set out. Whether by day or night, whether the cloud lifted, they set out. Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for 2 days or a month or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp and not set out. But when it lifted, they would set out. So once again, it all depended on what would happen with the cloud. But no one could predict how long the cloud would stay and where it would go. They were reactionary to it. They would respond to the whim and to the plan of God. Now keep in mind, this is a group of people who've been desperate for a long time. And they're easily offended. But they have to solely rely upon this one sign from God, the presence of God in the cloud. If it stayed for 3 days, if it stayed for a month, if it stayed for a year, their test was, are you going to stay put, or are you going to live in desperation, or to live in complaint about it? Because you know there had to be some young, upstart, wannabe heroes in their midst that said, aren't you guys tired of being in this location? Like, what happens if we just kind of journey away from here and go at it on our own? A new startup company. Without the cloud, we could do what we want. Wouldn't that be awesome? You know that there had to be the temptation there. But bit by bit, as they waited on the cloud, they learned over and over again they could trust God. They had a test every single morning. Would we remain because the cloud is remaining? Or would we go because the cloud seems to be on the move? Can we trust another day? Can we believe another day? And bit by bit, over time, this young, vulnerable community learned what it means to trust God on the average mundane days. Sure, it's quite the phenomenon to wake up and to see the cloud in the sky. Like, that would be amazing every single time. But to trust that since it was there 3 days, is it going to be 3 days the next time? No, it's going to be 6 months. Now it's just going to be 24 hours. Now it's going to be 9 days. Oh, it's a leap year, so let's carry the one and make sure that we're here long enough. I mean, they had no idea what was going to happen next. And so their life was reduced to wake up and to watch the cloud. But in the meantime, they knew that they could trust God with every single day of their existence. As I think about this story, it reminds me of the early church community as well. This is Pentecost Sunday, which is 50 days after the Passover, 7 weeks after Easter, where we celebrate and recognize the birth of the mission of the church. Even though God's been working among a group of people for some time from the very beginning, even though before anything was created, God envisioned a church, something happened, a watershed moment happened as is recorded in Acts chapter 2, where the first followers of Jesus received authority for their commission, and they began to be witnesses to the gospel of Jesus Christ. But they weren't an energized and confident group of people. In fact, the Apostle Paul tells us that when Jesus was raised from the dead, he appeared to 500 people. But we see in Luke's gospel that he's asking those people that he appeared to wait. We see in Luke chapter 24, verse 49. Go to the next slide for me, Tom. It says, Jesus says this after his resurrection and before he ascends to the Father, I'm going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high. Just like the Old Testament community in Numbers chapter 9, Jesus is asking the early believers to wait for the sign before they move. So once again, 500 have received this command. But Acts chapter 2 tells us that 120 people are in an upper room in the city of Jerusalem. Now, we like to think the upper room means an upper hand of position, a confident place, a place of authority. But it seems like as we read that story, these people are frightened. They've been following Jesus of Nazareth. He's a controversial figure. Sure, he was raised from the dead, but he's no longer with them. What are we going to do from here? So they're in an upper room, and just before they get to the upper room, Jesus gives them a commission. You're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, which would have terrified them. Because as sectarian Jews, uneducated, unproven leaders from Galilee, to be given a task like that seemed impossible. How would they be able to fulfill the command that God gave them? So they're in an upper room, and they're praying. And Acts chapter 2 tells us, as they're praying, the Holy Spirit enters the room. He fills each person in the room. Clothed in tongues of fire rests upon all of them. And they begin to praise God in different languages. Not the Galilean tongue, but different languages. And it just so happens that there are pilgrims from all over the known world in Jerusalem at that time, from all these different places. And as that sound of that music, of that worship begins to billow outside of that room, they begin to hear God praised in all these foreign languages. And something dawns upon the church in that moment. That the task Jesus gave us seems to be monumental. It seems to be out of our reach from our previous experience. But just like the cloud that followed the people of God through the wilderness in the Old Testament, God was with the early church in their first days. He's in the middle of their difficult commission. He gave them the authority. He gave them the ability and the empowerment to fulfill their task. They weren't abandoned. They weren't left alone. They didn't need to be a desperate people. They didn't need to be an offended people. They just needed to be a people that would trust God. What we see as we look at Numbers chapter 9, as we look at the early church, that there was a recalibration that happened in each of those communities. Instead of looking at the world around them as a scary place, as a place where scarcity abounds, that's threatening to them, that actually the world is brimming with potential. There's an optimistic future. God's story is going somewhere. Therefore, we don't have to be animated by fear and by dread and by pain and by suffering and by sadness and by our previous mistakes. But God's doing a new thing. He's going to be with us. He's going to empower us. He's going to follow us along the way, and we're going to see some great and unusual things. That was some pretty good preaching, folks. I don't know about that, man. And I know that you can see the clock, and I know that we've got 5 minutes left, and we got one worship song to sing before you go to lunch. But that's something to celebrate, because here's the deal. There's a temptation to be desperate in our current moment. We're being discipled to see the world around us as a place of scarcity where there's not enough. The media outlets in our world would try to make us cause to be worried so much that we no longer think, but we are mobilized for their agenda. But Jesus speaks a different word. That no longer do we need to be scared. No longer do we feel like we're always in desperation. It's third and long. We don't got to play to get their yardage remaining nor to get a first down. But Jesus is raised from the tomb. Jesus is still with us. So as people of God, if there's one group of people in existence who should be full of optimism, full of hope, who should be buoyant, who should be eager, it should be the people of God. So on this Pentecost morning, as we think about our opportunity around us, may we learn about the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. May we remember the story of a great prayer meeting in an upper room of 120 scared individuals who didn't know up from down and which way to go forward next, but God met them there. And let's embrace Jesus once again this morning. And let's look at the world around us not as a place of scarcity that we have to hide from, but a place that's brimming with potential if we choose to believe. May we be that buoyant people of God this morning.